Bibliophiles of the internet, today I thought I would share some underrated gems that I read in 2023. I know we're all done talking about 2023, but too bad. I'm still talking about it. Like many bookish content creators this time of year, I've been knee-deep sorting through 2023 data and stats to help me make my end-of-the-year type videos and content. I log my reading online, of course, and I also keep a spreadsheet of my reading every year as well. And I think when we're celebrating the highs and lows of the year in retrospect, whether that's best of the year, worst of the year, what have you, there's a lot of really great books that get left out. For perspective, I read 137 books in 2023, and I believe I included 36 of those books in my best books of the year video, which means there were 101 other books left over. And yes, I did not love all of them, but some I did really enjoy, and even though they didn't get the highest accolade of the year, I still think they deserve some love. So that's what got the wheels turning for me with this video. Yes, I've talked about all of these books on my channel in this past year, so it's not new information, but I thought I'd go through each month and pick one underrated book to recommend that perhaps you missed in 2023 or even in years previous. There was some criteria for how I chose these books, so I'll give a quick overview of that first if you're interested. If you're not, feel free to skip ahead. So I'm using the word underrated in both a literal and non-literal sense. So these books are quantifiably underrated, but this is also a little bit subjective, and you'll see why that is. First of all, every single one of these books has well under 5,000 ratings on Goodreads. Obviously, here's the part where I disclaim that Goodreads is not the be-all end-all litmus test of which books are being read or even talked about the most. It's not always an accurate reflection of how well a book is doing. It's a deeply imperfect platform that I do not love, but it also remains one of the biggest websites where people consistently track their books. The only other rule I had for myself is that I couldn't name any book that appeared in my best books of the year video, which seems obvious, but again, in researching the ratings of the books I read last year, a lot of my favorites were technically underrated. But again, the point of this video is to put the spotlight on some lesser known or lesser read books. The third and last thing I'll say about how I built this list is that there is some subjectivity to these selections. I didn't always just choose the book with the absolute lowest amount of ratings. I also allowed myself to contextualize my choices by thinking about which books I personally haven't seen people review or talk about much. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that helps. Let's just move on with that in mind and talk about the books. So for January, I chose Promise Boys by Nick Brooks, which has 4,700 ratings and I believe is technically the most rated out of all of these books. This is a phenomenal YA mystery thriller where the principal of an urban prep school is found murdered and 3 of the students are flagged as the prime suspects. According to the police, they all had the means, the motive, and access to possible murder weapons, but each of the boys doesn't know whether the other 2 are the actual killer, and they all have different perspectives of what actually happened that day and ideas as to who might be framing them. So they actually band together to try and figure out what happened and uncover the true culprit. What I love so much about this book is that it feels incredibly expansive, especially for a story that revolves around one specific moment on one specific day. But you really get this kaleidoscope of perspectives, not only from the 3 main characters, but also through interlude chapters that highlight different voices in the affected community. It's also a thriller that preys on your assumptions, but very intentionally so as part of its project in commenting on how it's easy to pin the moniker of guilty on young boys of color before knowing the whole story, and how boys of color have to fight for their innocence while their peers don't have to do anything to earn it. It's twisty, it's exciting, it's thought-provoking, it's cinematic, it's highly suspenseful and complex. Like I said, I know this book is slightly higher rated compared to some of the other books on this list, but I still want everyone to read this. For February, I chose Her Good Side by Rebecca Weatherspoon, which has been rated around 1,100 times. This is Rebecca Weatherspoon's YA romance debut. We start off with Bethany, a black, fat, confident, hopeless romantic, despite the fact that she doesn't actually have any dating experience. Then we also have Jacob, a Korean-American photographer and social media whiz who's gotten a lot of romantic attention since he went through a pretty drastic growth spurt, but he's also been dumped twice in 2 months. Turns out one of his recent exes is one of Bethany's best friends, and because the breakup was fairly amicable and peaceable, this friend decides to set the two of them up since both Jacob and Bethany need dates to the homecoming dance. But Bethany decides to take things one step further and propose that they use this setup as an opportunity to start a fake relationship, which she figures will basically give them a chance to get some more dating experience under their belts without any of the pesky emotions. Because of course, that's gonna be how that works. This book is so fun, so cute, so sweet, far and away one of the best YA romances I read last year, without question. It is a complete and utter delight. My favorite thing about it, which I've talked about before, is how the story beautifully shows what it means to be in a safe and healthy relationship, which I think a lot of young people need a model for in their lives. And because these two characters basically have an agreement between them, they also get to talk a lot about their respective boundaries and expectations. But outside of that, it's also just really fun. It's fluffy, it's endearing, it's feel good, and it has all the shenanigans you could possibly want from any good fake dating romance. For March, I chose I'll Take Everything You Have by James Cleese, coming in at just 375 ratings. This is a queer historical YA story, which is a big part of why I think it's underrated, but it's really good. It's set in the 1930s following Joe, who just arrived in Chicago. He's trying to find a job in the big city so he can send money back to the family farm and help them pay off their debt. At first, everything's going great. His cousin sets him up with this hotel job, which pays a decent wage, but then his cousin ropes him into a very sketchy, highly illegal scheme to try and make some money fast. I think this book is criminally underrated, no pun intended. It's equal parts queer coming of age as Joe is given the space and freedom to finally explore who he really is now that he's living independently from his family, and also gritty crime story as this get-rich-quick scheme spirals more and more out of hand. I think the story beautifully balances those two very different plot lines and marries them together into something unforgettable. Especially as a queer boy in the 1930s, Joe is forced to basically live a double life in a lot of ways, and so I think the duality of the story really speaks to that. It's dark, but it's hopeful. I think the historical backdrop is absolutely fascinating and really well researched, and I would absolutely recommend it. I chose an adult book for April, and that was Hestia Strikes a Match by Christine Grillo, which has been rated about 857 times. It's adult fiction, some might say lit fic, but it's mostly like a strangely lighthearted mixture of near-future dystopia and satire, but not dystopia like in a sci-fi sense, just in the sense that the world has been drastically restructured for the worst. In this not-so-distant future America, certain conservative states have successfully seceded from the United States in order to govern themselves, which sparks a new civil war that tears families and communities apart, both geographically and politically. But that struggle is mostly a backdrop for the story, which is following our main character, Hestia, who's still combing the dating apps and trying to find love even amidst this political hellscape. Even though I don't think this story always adequately addresses everything it's trying to take on, I still enjoyed it very much. Generally speaking, I think it's a really effective use of satire because it's taking the seeds of current political dynamics and exaggerating them to show how ridiculous it would be to try and forcefully revert this country to its white supremacist roots. And while that's pretty heavy commentary, Hestia's storyline really balances it out and brings in this much needed sense of levity as she basically tries to find love at the end of the world. And I think that makes the whole concept feel much more approachable than it first seems. I do have a written review for this book that you can check out if you want, and in that review I do talk about how I wish the story had gone further, but overall I still enjoyed this and I think a lot of people would enjoy it, so I do recommend it. For May, I chose The Genesis of Misery by Neon Yang, which surprisingly to me comes in at just over 1,600 ratings. This is a queer sci-fi pitched as Joan of Arc in space, and my god, that is truly what this is. It's about a character named Misery who uses she/they pronouns, and she's from this nowhere planet, but she actually possesses the very rare stone-working powers of a saint. Unfortunately, with that power comes the susceptibility to these hallucinatory episodes known as void madness, and so to avoid scrutiny, Misery hides their powers for years. But then the voice of an angel, or perhaps a very convincing hallucination, leads Misery into the heart of this galactic empire, where they find themselves trapped between two powerful factions who both want to use Misery's power to win a terrible war. Every time I talk about this book, the most emphatic, most definitive thing I can say about it is that it's really fucking cool. It just is. It's this epic, skull-crushing sci-fi mecha story about an absolute disaster trans main character who's masquerading as the Messiah and openly manipulating these two warring factions according to their own whims, and all of that is fantastic. And this may not be the popular opinion, but I love how the story keeps you guessing the entire way through in regards to what's true and what's not. Your opinions of the characters are constantly changing depending on what you're learning as the story goes, and I think that actually makes it incredibly enticing because you want to see which truth or which version of the truth is the one that wins out in the end. It's action-packed, it's mind-bending, it has delicious political and religious drama. Once again, not a perfect book, but a perfectly chaotic book and perfect for me, and I can't say enough good things. June was my biggest reading month by far, so it was really tough to get it down to just one book, and there was absolutely no shortage of choices, but I went with You Don't Have a Shot by Raquel Marí, which has about 1,500 ratings. This is a queer YA sports rivals to lovers romance. It's about Valentina, who's an incredibly dedicated soccer player, and she's very intense about it because she feels like it's basically her entire identity. It's her past, present, and future. But after getting into a fight during a playoff game with her longtime rival Leticia, that future seems to be slipping from her grasp. So to get away from all that, Vale escapes to her childhood soccer camp for the summer, only to find out that she and Leticia, of all people, will be co-captaining a team that could potentially end up playing in front of college scouts. Raquel's debut, Ophelia After All, was one of my favorite books of 2022, and it was also pretty well received. That's why I want to show this sophomore novel a little bit more love. I always say that if you're someone who loves Running with Lions, as you should, then trust me when I say that You Don't Have a Shot is like its beautifully messy, sapphic counterpart. Like many books I tend to love, this story has a wonderfully complex duality to it. On the one hand, it's a fun, summery sports romance, but on the other hand, it also pulls no punches when it comes to exploring how grief, trauma, and insecurity manifest themselves in the choices we make. Vale goes on a very satisfying journey from being a destructive person to learning how to take accountability and depend on other people, as scary as it seems. The story is both thoughtful and deeply romantic, and I think more people should read it. In comparison to June, July was a much more sparse reading month. I didn't have much to choose from, I can't lie, but middle grade books are always a safe bet when it comes to abysmally underrated books. So I went with The Demon Sword Asperities by Sarah Jean Horwitz, which has been rated exactly 116 times. It's a middle grade fantasy adventure story about a recently retired demon sword, Asperities, who's tired of tricking humans into wielding him in exchange for their souls. But one day he realizes that someone is trying to resurrect his last wielder, who was an incredibly evil sorcerer, so that would be very inconvenient. So he's reluctantly drawn back into action, searching for a new wielder to help him vanquish this evil threat, which is when he comes across Knack, a young wannabe knight who's been exiled from his family and is desperate to prove himself. This is such a fun twist on a classic knight's tale. It's quirky, it's funny, it has a great sense of adventure, there's a really wonderful cast of characters, and the story is also very heartfelt in the way it explores how being a hero can look like so many different things. I also love how it poses really interesting questions about morality, especially with these two main characters who are very firmly positioned as good and evil respectively, so it's interesting to see them work together even though their beliefs and their alignments are very different. Like I said, it's a bold and exciting take on a fairy tale kind of story, and I enjoyed it very much. August is a little unique because I chose something from an author who I talk about a lot, so you've definitely heard about them, but they're still very underread in a broad sense, so I thought I'd once again recommend Wolf Willow Witch by Freydis Moon, which has 376 ratings. This is technically not breaking my rule because even though this is the sequel to Heart Hunt Havoc, which is one of my favorite books of 2023, my best book list did not include this book. It's both a companion to and continuation of Heart Hunt Havoc, and it's another indie horror romance. And by the way, some people ask if you can read this series in whatever order you want, and while technically you can, it's recommended that you read them in publication order because later books will spoil previous books. In this story, we're following Teller Nilsson, who practices Norse magic, and when she finds herself alone in her friend's empty house, she feels this lingering energy surrounding a hidden corpse, and she can't help but raise this corpse from the dead. There's a lot happening here. There's resurrection, there's forbidden magic, there's a heist element as these two unlikely partners try to infiltrate a religious cult in order to obtain a powerful relic. I think Freydis always describes this as a villain-villain romance because it's following these two horrendous, unquestionably bad characters. It's really interesting to see the push and pull in their relationship, especially because both characters have their own sort of dark powers. And I always love the way Freydis plays with the quote-unquote perversion of religious power, which is once again on display in this book. I know it's a sequel, which is one of the reasons why it's a little less read, but overall I definitely recommend the series. September was another tricky month because a lot of books I loved in September were either in my best books of the year video or very well read, so I settled on How Moon Fuentes Fell in Love with the Universe by Raquel Vasquez Gilliland, which has just under 4,000 ratings. This is a YA contemporary Latina coming-of-age romance story about a Mexican-American teenager named Moon Fuentes, who is basically the social media manager for her twin sister, who's this huge purity influencer online. When her sister's invited to go on this influencer tour across the country for the summer, Moon is dragged along to help her sell merch at the venues, and she happens to get stuck not only working but bunking with the grumpiest, cutest boy she's ever met, Santiago Phillips. This recommendation comes with a huge caveat in regards to the fact that the story goes very much in depth exploring child abuse, sometimes in a graphic sense, as well as parental death by suicide and also grief. So if those topics are a consideration for you, please be mindful of that going into this. This is a very hard book to recommend in some ways because it's absolutely heart-wrenching to read at times. It's full of so much pain and so much grief. Moon is also overcoming some very deep insecurities regarding her body and physical intimacy, but at the same time, I very strongly feel like this is the kind of story that can change someone's life. Yes, it tackles a lot of difficult things and sometimes in uncomfortable ways, but it also leaves room for softness and gentleness and healing in a way that can be very cathartic. So if that sounds like something you need in your life and you feel like you can deal with the subject matter, then maybe you should check this out. For October, I chose The Luis Ortega Survival Club by Sonora Reyes, which has been rated just over 1,500 times. This is a queer Latina YA contemporary story about Ariana Ruiz, who is autistic and largely nonverbal. Because she doesn't talk often, she mostly gets ignored by her peers, which is why it's such a big deal when Luis, one of the most popular boys in school, takes notice of her and tries to be friends. They end up going to a party together and having sex, which Ari did not consent to at any point. And before she can even figure out what to do about it or how to feel about it, the school is buzzing with rumors about how she is promiscuous. Shortly afterwards, though, Ari finds a note in her locker that leads her to a group of students who have gone through similar situations and who are secretly planning to expose and finally retaliate against Luis. Again, definitely be mindful of the fact that this story explores bullying, sexual harassment, and off-page instances of rape, as well as the trauma and grief that often comes with it, but I think it's also balanced out with this really wonderful, endearing, and supportive found family, and ultimately the story is leading towards a hopeful place. I feel like this story is really about the formation of community in even the most hopeless or overwhelming circumstances. It's about reclaiming your autonomy and your power. It's about learning how to name and also dismantle systems of violence, but it also reads like a fun revenge story at the same time. Again, Sony's first book was received incredibly well and it's been read quite a bit, as it absolutely should be, but I think this sophomore novel of theirs also deserves that same kind of love. I know I've said some variations of this, but November was actually the most difficult month to narrow down because it was far and away one of my best reading months in terms of favorites. Not counting rereads, I read 7 new-to-me books in November, and 5 of those books ended up in my best books of the year video. So I really only had 2 to choose from, and one of those is a 2024 release that hasn't come out yet, so I kind of by default had to go with Kingdom of Without by Andrea Tang, which has only 92 ratings. Again, this is such a unique genre blend that hits on so many niches that really excite me. It's historical sci-fi mixed with cyberpunk and just a pinch of crime fiction. The story is an alternate history set in Beijing, and we're following Ninger, who's been fighting her entire life to scrape by in the 6th ring, which is the most impoverished section of the city. She's desperate to secure a next job, and that's when she hears about an anonymous employer looking to hire a thief for a very specialized heist. She accepts without without question, only to discover that this employer is actually a high-ranking political official turned revolutionary who's hoping to lead a small band of insurgents to break out a rebel leader from a high-security laboratory. This book was pitched as being inspired by Les Mis by way of Six of Crows and Full Metal Alchemist, and I stand by my assessment when I say you can absolutely see all of those influences in this story. It's fast-paced, it's high-octane, it's very tightly plotted. If you're into suspenseful sci-fi thrillers with a high concentration of political complexity, then you should definitely read this. And I said this in my initial review, but besides being an exciting read in terms of genre and plot, the story also has really important things to say about the mental, social, and emotional labor that each and every one of us has to take on in order for revolutionary movements to be sustainable and successful, which remains incredibly relevant. Last but certainly not least, we come to December. This one again was kind of tough because the books I had to choose from that weren't favorites were either 2024 releases or incredibly well-read books. So I chose to once again spotlight North Ranger by Ray Tercero and Brie Indigo, which has been rated just barely over 2,000 times. This is a graphic novel, it's queer, it's about a Latina main character, it's a modern YA reimagining of Northanger Abbey, and it's also set on a ranch in small-town Texas. The story follows a closeted Latina teenager named Cade Munoz, whose summer is completely upended when his parents volunteer him to work as a ranch hand to earn some extra money for the family since things are kinda tight. And even though Cade is very much not cut out for the ranch life, luckily the ranch owner has two teenage twins around his age, and Cade starts to really hit things off with one of them, Henry, and they start a little bit of a secret romance. But things get complicated when Cade realizes there's a lot about Henry's past that he's not ready to open up about, and it's unclear whether their newfound relationship will be able to withstand the weight of all these secrets. As I've said before, this is such a great take on a Jane Austen classic. Somehow it's able to retain the gothic elements of the original even in a modern day setting, and it very creatively brings those into the fold while still being a very heartfelt and tender coming-of-age story and teenage romance. It's so beautifully illustrated as well in a way that really captures these expansive settings of the ranch and Henry's family lake house. So it's a very immersive kind of read, and I had a really great time with it. The story balances a lot of really interesting genre inputs, it depicts a really sweet romance, and overall I think as a classic retelling it can absolutely be classified as a success. So those are 12 underrated books that I quite enjoyed in 2023 that I think more people should read. Hopefully this was interesting or reminded you to look up some of these books for yourself. If it did, let me know in the comments or feel free to share some of your own underrated books. That is everything I had to recommend for today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.